The sound of Dr. Robert Mitchell's hand striking Jessica Chen's face echoed through the supply closet like a gunshot. What happened next would cost Sarah Martinez her career, shatter a doctor's shoulder, and within 24 hours, transform her life in ways she never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital hummed, their familiar tune as Sarah Martinez clocked in for what would become the most defining night shift of her 15-year nursing career. The Phoenix summer heat still radiated from the asphalt outside, but inside the emergency department, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the constant flow of patients, families, and the relentless energy that pulsed through the corridors like a living thing. Sarah adjusted her navy blue scrubs and pulled her dark hair back into the practical ponytail that had become her signature look. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen everything the emergency room could throw at her. Overdoses, gunshot wounds, heart attacks, car accidents, domestic violence cases, pediatric emergencies that would break most people's hearts. She had stitched wounds under pressure, performed CPR until her arms ached, and held the hands of dying patients while their families said goodbye. Nothing surprised her anymore, or so she thought. The EA was already chaotic when she arrived. Summer nights in Phoenix brought their own special brand of madness. Heat exhaustion, pool accidents, bar fights, and the general restlessness that came when temperatures refused to drop below 90 degrees even after sunset. The waiting room buzzed with activity as families clustered around plastic chairs, some crying, others staring blankly at muted television screens broadcasting the late news. Sarah made her way to the nurses' station where Patricia Johnson, a veteran nurse with silver hair and laugh lines, earned through 3 decades of emergency medicine, was updating the patient board with a dry erase marker that had seen better days. "How's it looking tonight, Pat?" Sarah asked, washing her hands at the small sink beside the computer terminals. Patricia glanced up, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. 3 car accident victims in trauma 2, possible stroke in bed 6, and we've got a full house in the waiting room. Oh, and Dr. Mitchell is in one of his moods again. Sarah's jaw tightened at the mention of Robert Mitchell. The man was a talented emergency physician, there was no denying that. He could diagnose complex conditions with remarkable speed and had steady hands during procedures that would make lesser doctors nervous. But his talent came wrapped in an ego the size of Arizona and a temper that had been getting worse over the past 6 months. She had watched him berate nurses for minor mistakes, snap at residents who asked questions, and treat support staff like they were invisible. The younger nurses were particularly vulnerable to his outbursts, and Sarah had noticed several of them requesting schedule changes to avoid working his shifts. Management either didn't notice or didn't care, as long as his patient outcomes remained excellent and the complaints didn't make it to the medical board. What happened this time? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Jessica made the mistake of suggesting he might want to double-check a medication dosage. You know how she is, always trying to be thorough, always wanting to learn. He went off about nurses questioning doctors and stormed out of the room muttering about incompetence. Sarah felt her stomach twist. Jessica Chen was 24 years old, fresh out of nursing school, and eager to prove herself in the high-pressure environment of emergency medicine. She reminded Sarah of herself 15 years ago, full of idealism and determination to make a difference. The young nurse asked thoughtful questions, stayed late to help with difficult cases, and had the kind of gentle bedside manner that could calm even the most agitated patients. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked. "Supply closet, restocking." I think she needed a few minutes to compose herself. Sarah nodded and made her way toward the supply closet, a narrow room lined with shelves of gauze, syringes, 4 bags, and the countless other materials that kept the EO functioning. She could hear movement inside and knocked gently on the doorframe. "Jessica, you okay in there?" The door opened to reveal the young nurse with red-rimmed eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she organized boxes of latex gloves. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just catching up on inventory." "Honey, you don't have to pretend with me. I heard what happened." Jessica's composure cracked just enough for Sarah to see the frustration and hurt underneath. "I don't understand why he hates me so much. I'm trying my best, I really am. I just wanted to make sure the dosage was right for a pediatric patient. The child only weighed 30 pounds, and the standard adult dose seemed too high." "You were absolutely right to question it," Sarah said firmly. "That's exactly what a good nurse should do. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But maybe I should have been more respectful about how I asked. Maybe I should have waited until we were alone, or stop." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "You did nothing wrong. A good doctor would have thanked you for catching a potential error. Dr. Mitchell's reaction says everything about him and nothing about you." Jessica managed a small smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I needed to hear that." They worked together for a few minutes, restocking supplies and talking about proper medication protocols. Sarah found herself sharing stories from her early days as a nurse, the mistakes she had made, the doctors who had mentored her, and the ones who had tried to tear her down. She was just explaining the importance of trusting your instincts when heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "Where the hell is that incompetent little nurse?" Dr. Mitchell's voice carried clearly through the thin walls of the supply closet. "I need someone to assist with the trauma in bed too, and I don't have time for her amateur hour questions." Sarah felt Jessica tense beside her. The young nurse's hands were shaking again, and she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible. "I should go," Jessica whispered. "He needs help with the trauma. Take a breath first," Sarah advised. "Center yourself. Remember, you're a damn good nurse, and any patient would be lucky to have you caring for them." Jessica nodded and straightened her shoulders, trying to summon the confidence that Dr. Mitchell's constant criticism had eroded. She stepped toward the door just as it swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Dr. Robert Mitchell filled the doorway, his tall frame blocking most of the light from the hallway. At 48, he was an imposing figure with graying temples, cold blue eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. Tonight, his face was flushed with anger, and the smell of coffee and frustration seemed to radiate from him like heat from a furnace. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "While you've been hiding in here playing with bandages, I've got a trauma patient bleeding out in bed too. Do you think you can manage to assist without questioning every decision I make?" "Yes, doctor," Jessica replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't hear you," Mitchell snapped. "Speak up. If you can't communicate clearly, you have no business working in my emergency room." "Yes, doctor," Jessica repeated, louder this time, but Sarah could see the way her hands clenched at her sides. "That's better. Now listen carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once. The patient has a penetrating abdominal wound, possible liver laceration, blood pressure dropping fast. I need you to get the trauma cart, call for 2 units of O-negative blood, and prepare for possible emergency surgery. Think you can handle that without screwing it up?" Sarah watched Jessica nod eagerly, desperate to prove herself. "Yes, doctor, right away. And for God's sake, stop asking stupid questions about dosages and protocols. I've been practicing medicine longer than you've been alive. When I give an order, you follow it, period." Jessica hurried past him toward the trauma bay, but Mitchell wasn't finished. He stepped further into the supply closet, backing Jessica against the shelving unit. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his voice low and menacing. I don't have time for nervous little girls who second-guess every decision. This is life and death medicine, not nursing school. Either you learn to follow orders without question, or you find yourself another career." Sarah felt her protective instincts flare as she watched the young nurse's face go pale. "Dr. Mitchell, Jessica is an excellent nurse. She was right to question that pediatric dosage earlier." Mitchell turned his cold gaze toward Sarah, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. He knew her reputation, knew she had 15 years of experience and the respect of the entire nursing staff. But tonight, his anger seemed to override his usual political caution. "I don't remember asking for your opinion, Nurse Martinez. Perhaps you should focus on your own patients instead of defending incompetence." "There's nothing incompetent about following safety protocols," Sarah replied evenly. "Jessica potentially prevented a medication error. That's what good nurses do." The temperature in the small room seemed to drop several degrees. Mitchell stepped closer to Sarah, using his height advantage to loom over her in a way that would have intimidated most people. But Sarah had faced down angry drunks, grieving family members, and aggressive patients who outweighed her by 100 pounds. One arrogant doctor didn't scare her. "I'm going to give you some free advice, Martinez. You're getting a little too comfortable questioning medical decisions. Remember your place in the hierarchy here. Nurses don't second-guess doctors. They follow orders. When those orders are wrong, we absolutely question them," Sarah shot back. "Patient safety comes first, always." Mitchell's face flushed darker. "You think you know better than someone with 20 years of medical training? You think your little nursing degree makes you qualified to question my clinical judgment?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Jessica stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Please, I should get to the trauma bay. The patient needs—" "Shut up," Mitchell snapped, not even looking at her. "I'm talking to your supervisor here about appropriate professional boundaries." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. Sarah watched the young nurse's face crumple, all her earlier confidence evaporating under the doctor's casual cruelty. "Don't talk to her like that," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I'll talk to her however I damn well please. She works for me, and so do you. Maybe it's time both of you remembered that." Sarah felt something dangerous rising in her chest. She had seen this pattern before in toxic doctors, who confused their medical degree with a license to abuse the people around them. She had watched good nurses leave the profession because of men like Mitchell, had seen young women's confidence destroyed by physicians who seemed to take pleasure in wielding their power like a weapon. "Actually, we don't work for you," Sarah said quietly. "We work with you. There's a difference." Mitchell's laugh was cold and humorless. "Really? Is that what you think?" He turned to Jessica, who was pressed against the shelving unit like a cornered animal. "Tell me, Nurse Chen, who writes your performance evaluations? Who determines whether you keep your job here?" Jessica's voice was barely audible. "You do, doctor. That's right. And what happens to nurses who can't follow simple orders? Who think they know better than their superiors?" Tears were forming in Jessica's eyes, and Sarah could see the young woman's spirit breaking in real time. This wasn't just professional criticism. This was psychological torture designed to break down someone's confidence and establish dominance through fear. "They get fired," Jessica whispered. "Exactly. So when I give you an order, what do? I follow it, even if you think it's wrong?" Sarah watched Jessica struggle with the question, her professional ethics warring with her desperate need to keep her job. I don't know." "Wrong answer," Mitchell said, and before Sarah could react, his hand shot out and struck Jessica across the face with a sharp slap that echoed through the small room like a gunshot. The world seemed to slow down. Sarah watched Jessica's head snap to the side, saw the shock and pain in her eyes, felt something primal and protective explode in her chest like a dam bursting. 15 years of watching bullies abuse good people. 15 years of staying professional, while doctors like Mitchell destroyed the spirits of dedicated nurses. 15 years of being told to know her place in the hierarchy. It all crystallized, in that moment, into perfect, focused rage. Sarah's body moved before her mind could fully process what was happening. Her left hand grabbed the front of Mitchell's lab coat, while her right hand drew back and delivered a punch that carried behind it every ounce of frustration, anger, and protective fury she had been holding back for years. Her fist connected with Mitchell's shoulder with a sickening crack that sounded like a tree branch snapping. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward into the hallway, where he collapsed against the far wall, clutching his shoulder and screaming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You broke my shoulder. She broke my shoulder. Security. I need security. Sarah stood in the doorway of the supply closet, breathing hard, her knuckles already beginning to swell. Jessica stared at her with wide eyes, one hand pressed to her reddening cheek. Are you okay? Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Jessica nodded mutely, still in shock. The hallway began filling with people. Patricia Johnson appeared first, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of an experienced nurse. Marcus Williams, the senior attending physician, came running from the trauma bay. Miguel Rodriguez, the security guard, jogged down the corridor. With his radio crackling, Dr. Mitchell was still on the floor, cradling his shoulder and howling about assault charges and lawsuits. She attacked me. That psychotic nurse attacked me. I want her arrested. Marcus knelt beside Mitchell, his hands moving with professional efficiency as he examined the injured shoulder. It's dislocated, possibly fractured. We need to get you to radiology. I want her fired. Mitchell shouted, his face contorted with pain and rage. I want her arrested. I want her charged with assault. Sarah felt Miguel's hand on her arm, gentle but firm. Sarah, I need you to come with me. She nodded, looking back at Jessica one more time. The young nurse was crying now, but she managed to mouth, "Thank you," before Sarah was led away down the corridor. As they walked toward the security office, Sarah could hear Mitchell still shouting about pressing charges and lawsuits. She could hear the murmur of voices as the night shift tried to process what had just happened. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But mostly, she could hear the echo of that slap, the sound of a powerful man hitting a young woman who was just trying to do her job well. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would do it again. The only question now was how much it was going to cost her. The security office at St. Mary's General Hospital had seen its share of incidents over the years, but Miguel Rodriguez had never had to escort a nurse there for breaking a doctor's shoulder. He gestured for Sarah to take a seat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that faced a metal desk covered in incident reports and coffee stains. Sarah, you know I have to ask, Miguel said, settling his large frame into the chair behind the desk. What the hell happened back there? Miguel had worked hospital security for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed a reputation for fairness and common sense. He was the kind of man who could talk down an agitated family member or gently escort a confused patient back to their room without making them feel criminalized. Most importantly, he knew the difference between troublemakers and good people having bad moments. Sarah looked at her hands, noticing for the first time that her right knuckles were starting to bruise. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. He hit Jessica. He slapped her across the face for asking a legitimate question about patient safety. Miguel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. And you hit him back. I did. Hard enough to dislocate his shoulder. Apparently. They sat in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the emergency room filtering through the thin walls. A siren wailed outside as another ambulance arrived. The PA system crackled with requests for doctors to various rooms. Life at St. Mary's continued, but Sarah knew her part in it was probably over. Miguel, in 8 years working here, have you ever seen me lose my temper? Can't say that I have. Have you ever seen me raise my voice to a doctor, argue with administration, or cause any kind of trouble? No, Sarah, you've always been solid, professional. Then you know this wasn't about me having a bad day or some kind of personal vendetta against Dr. Mitchell. Miguel nodded slowly. I've heard things about Mitchell, rumors, complaints that never seem to go anywhere. They don't go anywhere because he's untouchable. Great diagnostician, brings in revenue, and the administration looks the other way when it comes to how he treats the staff. The door opened, and Janet Wilson from Human Resources entered the room carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who wished she was anywhere else. Janet was in her 50s, had worked at St. Mary's for over a decade, and had a reputation for being thorough but fair in her investigations. Sarah, she said, taking the remaining chair. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. So am I. Janet opened the folder and pulled out several forms. I need to get your statement about what happened tonight. Dr. Mitchell has made serious allegations, and the hospital has to investigate any incident involving violence between staff members. Sarah told her story from the beginning, starting with Jessica's legitimate question about medication dosage and ending with the moment she struck Mitchell. She spoke calmly and factually, not trying to minimize her actions or make excuses for the violence. Did anyone else witness Dr. Mitchell striking Nurse Chen? Janet asked. No, we were alone in the supply closet. So it's your word against his about what precipitated the physical altercation. It is. Janet made notes on her form, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Sarah, you understand that regardless of the circumstances, striking another employee is grounds for immediate termination. I understand. Dr. Mitchell wants to press criminal charges for assault. He's also talking about a civil lawsuit. Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Not only was she going to lose her job, but she might also face legal consequences that could destroy her family financially. She thought about David waiting at home, probably asleep in their bed, unaware that his wife's career had just imploded. She thought about Emma, their 16-year-old daughter, who was already stressed about college applications and didn't need the added burden of her mother being arrested. What happens now? Sarah asked. I have to complete my investigation, which means interviewing other staff members and reviewing any available security footage. Dr. Mitchell is being treated for his injury, and he'll be off duty for several days. You're suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. How long will that take? 48 to 72 hours, typically, Miguel spoke up. Janet, for what it's worth, Sarah's not going anywhere. She's not a flight risk, and she's been nothing but professional in all the years I've known her. I appreciate that, Miguel. Sarah, I'll need you to turn in your badge and any hospital property. You'll be notified of our decision once the investigation is complete. Sarah unclipped her hospital ID from her scrubs and placed it on the desk. 15 years of her life reduced to a plastic rectangle with her picture and employee number. She had worn that badge through flu pandemics, mass casualty events, and countless nights when she had been the difference between life and death for her patients. Can I at least check on Jessica before I leave? Janet shook her head. I'm sorry, but you're not allowed on hospital property during your suspension. Sarah nodded and stood to leave. As she reached the door, Miguel called her name. For what it's worth, he said quietly, some things are more important than policy. The parking lot was nearly empty as Sarah walked to her car, her footsteps echoing off the asphalt. The Phoenix heat had finally broken, and a slight breeze carried the scent of desert sage and cooling concrete. She sat in her Honda Civic for several minutes before starting the engine. trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Johnson. "Everyone's talking about what you did. Most of us think you're a hero. Take care of yourself." More messages followed. Nurses from different shifts, respiratory therapists, even some of the newer doctors expressing support and outrage over what had happened. Sarah read them all but didn't respond. What was there to say? She had ended her career in a moment of righteous anger, and now she had to face the consequences. The drive home took 20 minutes through empty streets lined with palm trees and strip malls. Sarah had made this journey hundreds of times, usually exhausted after a long shift, but satisfied with the work she had done. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like an ending. Her house was dark, except for the porch light David always left on for her. It was a modest 2-story home in a middle-class neighborhood, with a small front yard that David kept meticulously maintained and a backyard where they had hosted countless barbecues with friends and coworkers. The mortgage had 4 years left on it, and they had been planning to pay it off early with the overtime Sarah had been picking up. She sat in the driveway for another few minutes, gathering the courage to go inside and tell her husband that she had just thrown away their financial stability for the sake of a principal. David was a high school teacher, and while his job was stable, it didn't pay enough to support the family on its own. They needed her nursing salary, especially with Emma's college expenses looming. The front door opened before she reached it. David stood silhouetted in the doorway, wearing the old Phoenix Suns t-shirt he liked to sleep in and an expression of concern. "You're home early," he said, stepping aside to let her in. David Martinez was the kind of man who could read his wife's moods like a book. After 18 years of marriage, he knew when she had dealt with a difficult patient, when the hospital politics were getting to her, and when she needed space to decompress. Tonight, he knew something was seriously wrong. "Bad night?" he asked, following her into the kitchen. Sarah poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, trying to find the words. "I hit a doctor tonight." David blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Dr. Mitchell. He slapped one of the young nurses, and I broke his shoulder." "You broke his shoulder?" "Yes. And now?" "I'm suspended pending investigation. I'll probably be fired." "He might press charges." David pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down heavily. "Jesus, Sarah, what were you thinking?" The question hit her like a slap. Not because it was unfair, but because it was exactly what she had been asking herself since the moment her fist connected with Mitchell's shoulder. "I was thinking about Jessica standing there with tears in her eyes while this arrogant bastard destroyed her confidence. I was thinking about all the young nurses who've quit because of doctors like him. I was thinking about how many times I've stood by and watched good people get abused because speaking up would rock the boat." "So you decided to rock the boat by assaulting someone?" Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the incident. "He hit her, David. He hit a 24-year-old girl for asking a question about patient safety, and I snapped." David rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she recognized from their early years when money was tight and the stress of new parenthood was overwhelming. "Okay, we'll figure this out. Do you need a lawyer?" "I don't know yet. Janet from HR is investigating, and Mitchell is deciding whether to press charges. What does your union rep say?" Sarah closed her eyes. "I haven't called him yet." "Sarah, you need to call him tonight. This is exactly why you pay union dues." She knew he was right, but part of her didn't want to make it real by involving lawyers and union representatives. Part of her wanted to believe that somehow this would all work out, that the hospital would recognize she had been defending a colleague and find a way to keep her employed. "What are we going to do about money?" she asked quietly. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But they both knew it wouldn't be easy. David's teacher salary was barely enough to cover the mortgage and basic expenses. They would have to drain their savings, possibly downsize their lifestyle significantly. Emma's college fund might have to be sacrificed. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. David stood up and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. "Don't apologize for doing what you thought was right. We'll get through this." They held each other in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, but knowing that everything had changed. Sarah breathed in the scent of her husband's cologne and the laundry detergent they had been using for years, trying to memorize the moment before the real consequences began. Her phone rang, startling them both. The caller ID showed St. Mary's. Main number, Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, this is Marcus Williams. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted you to know that Dr. Mitchell's injury is more serious than we initially thought. The X-rays show a fracture along with the dislocation. He's going to need surgery." Sarah felt her stomach drop. A simple assault charge was bad enough, but causing an injury that required surgery would make everything much worse. How serious? "He'll be out of work for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer depending on how the surgery goes and his recovery." "Marcus, I know you have to ask, but is Jessica okay? Is she going to be in trouble for any of this?" "Jessica is fine." She gave her statement to Janet, and everyone believes her account of what happened. "She's not in any trouble." "Good. That's good. Sarah, I want you to know that what you did tonight took guts. Mitchell has been a problem for months, and administration has been ignoring it because he brings in revenue. Someone needed to stand up to him. It shouldn't have been me. It should have been addressed through proper channels." "You're right. But when the proper channels fail, sometimes good people have to make hard choices." After hanging up, Sarah called her union representative, a man named Robert Hoffman who had been fighting for nurses' rights for over 20 years. He listened to her story without interruption, asked a few pointed questions, and promised to meet with her first thing in the morning. "Sarah, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he said. "Physically striking another employee is one of the few things that can get you fired immediately, regardless of circumstances. But Mitchell hitting Jessica first changes the dynamic significantly." "How so?" "Self-defense extends to defense of others in many jurisdictions. If we can prove that you were protecting Jessica from ongoing assault, we might have a case for wrongful termination, but there were no witnesses. Jessica's testimony will be crucial. The pattern of Mitchell's behavior, complaints from other staff members, his reputation. We build a case that shows this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of an ongoing pattern of abuse." Sarah went to bed that night, knowing that sleep would be elusive. She lay next to David, listening to his steady breathing and trying to imagine what her life would look like in a week. Would she be in jail? Would they lose their house? Would she ever work as a nurse again? But underneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. For 15 years she had watched bullies abuse good people, and told herself that staying professional was more important than standing up for what was right. Tonight, she had finally drawn a line in the sand. The consequences might destroy her career and her family's financial stability, but she had protected someone who couldn't protect herself. In a profession built around caring for others, that had to count for something. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the bedroom windows, Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that the next 24 hours would bring changes to her life that she could never have imagined. The Arizona sun blazed through Sarah's bedroom window at 7:30 in the morning, painting harsh geometric patterns across the hardwood floor. She had managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep, her dreams filled with the sound of that slap echoing through the supply closet and the crack of Dr. Mitchell's shoulder beneath her fist. Now she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of her family beginning their day. Emma's alarm clock buzzed down the hall, followed by the shuffle of teenage feet and the slam of the bathroom door. David was already downstairs. The smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen, along with the low murmur of morning news on the television. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a life that was no longer normal. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn. Text messages from colleagues, missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and 3 voicemails from reporters who had somehow gotten hold of the story. News traveled fast in Phoenix's medical community, and apparently a nurse breaking a doctor's shoulder was too juicy a story to keep quiet. Sarah forced herself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the grime and stress of the previous night. When she looked in the mirror afterward, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Dark circles under her eyes, worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight, and a hollow expression that spoke of someone whose world had shifted fundamentally in the span of a few hours. She dressed in jeans and a simple blue blouse, clothes that felt strange after so many years of scrubs. As she descended the stairs, she could hear David explaining something to Emma in the careful, measured tone he used when delivering difficult news. "Mom got suspended from work yesterday," he was saying. "There was an incident with a doctor who was being inappropriate with one of the younger nurses." "What kind of inappropriate?" Emma asked, her 16-year-old instincts immediately. "Suspicious. The kind that requires someone to stand up and say it's not okay." Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairs, touched by how David had framed the situation. He could have told their daughter that her mother had assaulted a colleague and might be facing criminal charges. Instead, he had presented it as a matter of principle, of standing up for what was right. Emma looked up as Sarah entered the kitchen, her expression mixing concern with admiration. "Dad told me what happened. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just have to work through some legal stuff." "Good for you," Emma said firmly. "Someone needed to put that jerk in his place." "Language," David said automatically, but his heart wasn't in the correction. "Dad, he hit someone, a woman. Mom did the right thing." Sarah felt a surge of pride in her daughter, who had inherited her sense of justice and wasn't afraid to express it. Emma had always been the kind of kid who stood up for underclassmen being bullied and called out teachers who played favorites. Apparently, she had no patience for adults who abused their power either. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "I meet with my union representative this morning, and then we wait to see what the hospital decides," Sarah said, pouring herself coffee from the pot David had made. "There's a chance I could lose my job. Then you'll find another one. Phoenix has lots of hospitals. If only it were that simple." Sarah's termination would likely be flagged in her personnel file, making it difficult to find another nursing position. Even if criminal charges weren't filed, the assault would follow her wherever she tried to work in healthcare. Her phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. Robert Hoffman's name appeared on the caller ID. "Sarah, we need to move up our meeting. Can you be at my office in an hour?" "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Something's very right, actually. Channel 12 wants to interview you this afternoon, and we need to prepare." "Interview me? Why would they want to interview me?" "Because someone leaked Jessica Chen's statement to the press, and it paints a very different picture than what Dr. Mitchell has been telling people. The story is gaining traction on social media, and the hospital is starting to feel public pressure." Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since walking out of St. Mary's the night before: hope. Robert Hoffman's office was located in a modest strip mall between a tax preparation service and a Mexican restaurant, but it was the headquarters of one of the most effective nurses' unions in Arizona. The waiting room was decorated with photos of successful contract negotiations and newspaper clippings about nurses who had fought for better working conditions. Robert himself was a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of intense energy that came from decades of fighting for working people. He had been a nurse himself before going to law school and dedicating his career to labor advocacy. "Sarah, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." He spread several documents across his desk, including printed copies of social media posts and news articles that had appeared since the previous evening. First, the good news. Jessica Chen's statement corroborates everything you told me. Last night, she describes a pattern of verbal abuse from Dr. Mitchell, inappropriate comments about her competence, and confirms that he struck her before you intervened. And the bad news? Dr. Mitchell is claiming you attacked him without provocation. He's saying Jessica fabricated the assault allegation to cover for your violent behavior. Sarah felt her stomach clench. That's ridiculous. Why would Jessica lie about something like that? Because he's desperate. His story doesn't hold water, and he knows it. But here's where things get interesting. Robert pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a Twitter thread that had been shared hundreds of times overnight. It was written by Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief of emergency medicine at Phoenix Medical Center, St. Mary's biggest competitor. Dr. Foster worked with Mitchell at his previous hospital in California. She's been tweeting about his pattern of abusive behavior and the reasons he was quietly encouraged to leave that position. Sarah read the thread with growing amazement. Dr. Foster described incidents of Mitchell screaming at nurses, making inappropriate comments about female staff members, and creating such a toxic work environment that several experienced nurses had transferred to other departments. She's not the only one speaking out, Robert continued, pulling up more social media posts. Nurses from his previous hospital, colleagues who witnessed his behavior, even some doctors who worked with him are sharing their stories. Why now? Why didn't anyone speak up before? Because individually, these stories seem like isolated incidents. Personality conflicts, misunderstandings, he said, she said situations. But when you put them all together, they paint a picture of someone who has been abusing his position for years. Robert showed her more posts, a respiratory therapist describing how Mitchell had berated her in front of patients, a medical student recounting inappropriate comments about her appearance, a nurse practitioner who had filed a complaint that was buried by administration. The #MeToo movement changed how people think about speaking up, Robert explained. Your actions last night gave everyone permission to share their own experiences with Mitchell. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message. This one was from Marcus Williams. Hang in there. More people are coming forward every hour. You did the right thing. The hospital is in full damage control mode, Robert continued. They're realizing that firing you could be seen as retaliation against someone who is protecting a colleague from assault. So what does that mean for me? It means we have leverage. And it means Channel 12 wants to interview you because you've become the face of standing up to workplace bullying in healthcare. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. 24 hours ago, she had been a quiet nurse doing her job. Now she was apparently the center of a social media storm about medical workplace culture. I don't know if I'm ready for television interviews. You don't have to do it. But Sarah, this could be bigger than just your job. This could be about changing how hospitals handle abusive physicians. They spent the next hour preparing for potential media interviews, reviewing Sarah's statement, and discussing legal strategy. Robert was optimistic about her chances of keeping her job, but he warned that the legal situation was still uncertain. Mitchell could still press charges regardless of public opinion. And even if he doesn't, his lawyers might pursue a civil lawsuit. What would that mean? Potentially years of litigation and financial liability. But given what's coming out about his behavior, I doubt his attorneys will want this case to go to trial. As Sarah drove home from the meeting, she noticed her phone was buzzing constantly with calls and messages. The story had apparently been picked up by national news outlets, and reporters from across the country were trying to reach her. She stopped at a red light and scrolled through some of the messages. Most were supportive, from nurses and other healthcare workers who shared their own stories of dealing with abusive physicians. But there were also critics who accused her of having anger management issues and destroying a respected doctor's career over a misunderstanding. One message stood out from the rest. It was from an unknown number with a simple text: "Thank you for showing my daughter that someone would stand up for her. Jessica's mom." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she read the message. Whatever consequences she faced, whatever happened to her career, she had shown a young woman that she wasn't alone. When she arrived home, David was waiting with a concerned expression and a stack of newspapers. "You've made the front page of 3 different papers," he said, holding up copies of the Arizona Republic, the Phoenix New-Times, and the East Valley Tribune. The headlines varied, but the theme was consistent. Nurse breaks doctor's shoulder defending colleague. Hospital violence exposes culture of abuse. When healthcare heroes fight back. "This is surreal," Sarah said, sinking into their living room couch. "Emma wants to do a TikTok video supporting you." I told her absolutely not until we know how this plays out legally. Sarah's phone rang. Janet Wilson from Human Resources. "Sarah, I need you to come in this afternoon for a follow-up meeting. Can you be here at 3 o'clock? Am I being fired? We're still investigating. Please bring your union representative." After hanging up, Sarah called Robert to let him know about the meeting. He was already aware of it and had additional news. "I just got off the phone with the hospital's legal counsel. They want to discuss a resolution." "What kind of resolution?" "The kind where nobody gets fired and nobody goes to jail." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. The social media attention has them spooked. They're getting calls from donors, board members, and community leaders asking why they employed an abusive doctor and why they're considering firing the nurse who protected his victim." "What about criminal charges?" Mitchell's attorney called this morning. They're no longer pursuing assault charges. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. What changed their mind? Apparently, 3 more nurses from his previous hospital came forward with assault allegations overnight. His lawyer realizes that pressing charges against you would open him up to questions about his client's pattern of violent behavior. The relief was so overwhelming that Sarah had to sit down. The weight she had been carrying since the previous evening, the fear about jail time and financial ruin, suddenly lifted. "So what happens at the meeting this afternoon?" "We negotiate the terms of your return to work and make sure this doesn't happen again." As Sarah prepared for the meeting that afternoon, she reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 24 hours ago, she had been facing the end of her career and possible criminal prosecution. Now she was apparently in a position to negotiate her return to work and potentially influence hospital policy about workplace abuse. The transformation felt surreal, almost too good to be true. But as she read through the dozens of supportive messages from colleagues and strangers, she began to understand that her actions had tapped into something much larger than one incident in a supply closet. Healthcare workers across the country were sharing stories of abuse, bullying, and toxic workplace cultures that had been tolerated for too long. Her moment of righteous anger had given voice to countless others who had been suffering in silence. David drove her to the hospital for the meeting, holding her hand as they sat in the parking lot where this had all begun less than 24 hours earlier. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "I'm proud of you. Even though I could have destroyed our family's future, especially because you were willing to risk everything to protect someone who couldn't protect herself." As they walked toward the hospital entrance, Sarah noticed something different. Several nurses and support staff were gathered near the main doors, and when they saw her approaching, they began to applaud. Not loudly or dramatically, but with the quiet, respectful recognition that healthcare workers reserved for their own. Jessica Chen was among them, her face still showing a faint bruise from Mitchell's slap, but her eyes bright with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you," she mouthed as Sarah passed. Sarah nodded and continued toward what she hoped would be the beginning of her vindication rather than the final chapter of her nursing career. The conference room on the third floor of St. Mary's General Hospital had hosted countless meetings over the years, but none quite like this one. Sarah sat at the polished mahogany table across from a lineup of hospital administrators that looked like a corporate board of directors preparing for damage control. Janet Wilson from Human Resources occupied the chair to her right, flanked by Linda Thompson, the Chief Administrative Officer, and Dr. Richard Hayes, the Chief Medical Officer. At the head of the table sat CEO Margaret Sterling, a woman whose reputation for tough decision-making had earned her both respect and fear throughout the Phoenix medical community. Robert Hoffman adjusted his reading glasses and spread several folders across the table in front of him. And Sarah, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, created an almost theatrical atmosphere, as if this meeting would determine not just Sarah's future but set a precedent for how the hospital handled workplace conflicts going forward. "Before we begin," Margaret Sterling said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling boardrooms, "I want to acknowledge that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. Our goal today is to reach a resolution that serves the best interests of our patients, our staff, and this institution." Sarah studied the faces around the table, trying to read the dynamics at play. Janet Wilson looked uncomfortable, as if she had been tasked with defending policies she no longer believed in. Dr. Hayes appeared tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from dealing with a crisis that threatened the reputation he had spent decades building. Linda Thompson kept glancing at her phone, monitoring what Sarah assumed was the continuing social media storm surrounding the incident. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret continued, "we've completed our investigation into the events of Tuesday evening. We've interviewed multiple witnesses, reviewed available security footage from the hallway, and examined the statements provided by all parties involved." Robert leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over a legal pad. "And what conclusions has that investigation reached?" Dr. Hayes cleared his throat and consulted the document in front of him. "Our investigation confirms that Dr. Mitchell did strike Nurse Chen during their interaction in the supply closet. It also confirms that this physical contact preceded Mrs. Martinez's intervention." Sarah felt a wave of vindication wash over her. The hospital was officially acknowledging what she had known all along, that Mitchell had been the aggressor, and her actions had been in defense of a colleague. "However," Dr. Hayes continued, and Sarah's stomach tightened at the word, "the investigation also confirms that Mrs. Martinez's response resulted in significant injury to Dr. Mitchell, requiring surgical intervention and extended medical leave. Are you suggesting that the appropriate response to witnessing assault would have been to do nothing?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the sharp edge that had made him an effective advocate for nurses' rights. "We're suggesting that there might have been other ways to de-escalate the situation," Linda Thompson interjected. "Calling security, reporting the incident to a supervisor, documenting the behavior for formal complaint." Sarah couldn't remain silent any longer. While Jessica was being slapped across the face, while she was being humiliated and threatened by someone who held her career in his hands. How long should I have let that continue while I went through proper channels? "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret Sterling said, raising a hand to indicate that Sarah should let her finish, "we understand your protective instincts. What we're trying to determine is how to prevent similar incidents in the future." Robert shuffled through his papers and pulled out a thick folder. "Since we're discussing preventing future incidents, perhaps we should review the pattern of complaints that have been filed against Dr. Mitchell over the past 2 years. He opened the folder and began reading from what appeared to be a comprehensive list. Complaint filed by Nurse Amanda Ross in March of last year, alleging verbal abuse and intimidation. Dismissed as a personality conflict. Complaint filed by respiratory therapist Michael Chen in August, alleging inappropriate conduct during a code blue emergency. Dismissed due to lack of witnesses. Complaint filed by medical student Jennifer Walsh in November, alleging inappropriate comments about her appearance, dismissed as a misunderstanding. With each item Robert read, the administrator's expressions grew more uncomfortable. Sarah realized that her union representative had done his homework, compiling a record of complaints that painted a damning picture of the hospital's failure to address Mitchell's behavior. "The pattern continues," Robert said, turning pages. Complaint filed by nurse practitioner David Kim in February of this year, alleging that Dr. Mitchell threw medical equipment during a disagreement. Filed by laboratory technician Maria Santos in April, alleging that Dr. Mitchell berated her in front of patients. Filed by pharmacist Jennifer Taylor in June, alleging that Dr. Mitchell questioned her competence using profanity and personal attacks. "Mr. Hoffman," Dr. Hayes interrupted, "personnel matters are confidential, and these complaints were filed through official channels and documented in hospital records." Robert replied smoothly, "My client has a right to know whether the institution she's worked for faithfully for 15 years has been aware of Dr. Mitchell's pattern of abusive behavior." Margaret Sterling looked as if she had bitten into something sour. "The point of this meeting is not to relitigate past personnel decisions, but to address the current situation." "Actually, Miss Sterling, the point of this meeting is to determine whether my client returns to work or whether we pursue legal action for wrongful termination and retaliation," Robert said. "And that determination depends heavily on whether this hospital has been enabling an abusive physician while punishing the nurse who finally stood up to him." Sarah watched the power dynamics shift around the table. What had begun as a disciplinary meeting was turning into something much different. The hospital administrators were realizing that they were not in the driver's seat they had expected to occupy. Janet Wilson spoke up, her voice careful and measured. "Sarah, we want you to know that Dr. Mitchell has submitted his resignation. His last day of employment will be Friday of this week." Sarah blinked in surprise. "He resigned?" The circumstances surrounding Tuesday's incident, combined with the public attention and additional allegations that have emerged, made it clear that his continued employment here was no longer viable, Dr. Hayes explained. Robert leaned back in his chair, a satisfied expression crossing his face. "So to be clear, the physician who assaulted my client's colleague is no longer employed by this hospital, but you're still considering disciplinary action against the nurse who defended her." "The situation is more complex than that, Linda," Thompson said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, it's quite simple," Robert replied. "My client witnessed an assault, intervened to protect a colleague, and is now being treated as if she were the aggressor. Meanwhile, the actual aggressor is being allowed to resign quietly and move on to terrorize staff at some other hospital." Margaret Sterling had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the tone of someone making a final decision. "Mrs. Martinez, St. Mary's General Hospital, is prepared to offer you reinstatement to your position with no disciplinary action on your record. Your suspension will be classified as administrative leave, with full pay for the time you've been away from work." Sarah felt a surge of relief so intense that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Not only was she getting her job back, but the hospital was essentially admitting that her suspension had been inappropriate. "Additionally," Margaret continued, "we're implementing new policies for reporting and investigating workplace harassment and abuse. We're also establishing a peer advocacy program that will give staff members like yourself formal authority to intervene in situations where colleagues are being mistreated." Robert made notes on his legal pad, but Sarah could see that he wasn't finished negotiating. "That's an excellent start, Miss Sterling. However, given the public attention this case has received and the clear evidence of institutional failure to protect staff from an abusive physician, we believe additional measures are warranted." "What kind of additional measures?" "A public apology acknowledging the hospital's failure to address Dr. Mitchell's behavior and commending Mrs. Martinez for her courage in protecting a colleague. A monetary settlement compensating her for the emotional distress and reputation damage she suffered, and a commitment to policy changes that will prevent similar situations in the future. Sarah watched Margaret Sterling's face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to Robert's demands. The CEO was clearly not accustomed to being dictated to, but she was also pragmatic enough to recognize when she was in a weak negotiating position. We can certainly discuss a public statement acknowledging Mrs. Martinez's dedication to patient and staff safety, Margaret said carefully. As for monetary compensation, that would need to be reviewed by our legal department and insurance carriers. Of course, Robert replied. We're prepared to give you 48 hours to present a formal offer. If we can't reach an agreement by then, we'll be filing a wrongful termination lawsuit along with complaints to the State Nursing Board and the Joint Commission regarding the hospital's failure to maintain a safe working environment. The threat hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match. Sarah realized that Robert was playing hardball, using the leverage created by public sympathy and media attention to extract maximum concessions from the hospital. Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mr. Hoffman, we're trying to be reasonable here. Mrs. Martinez is getting her job back with no penalties. Isn't that what she wanted? What she wanted was to work in an environment where she didn't have to choose between her career and protecting a colleague from assault. Robert replied. What she wanted was to work for an institution that values staff safety as much as it values revenue generated by prominent physicians. Sarah found her voice again. I want to know that what happened to Jessica will never happen to another young nurse. I want to know that when someone reports inappropriate behavior, it will be investigated thoroughly instead of dismissed as a personality conflict. Those are reasonable expectations, Margaret Sterling acknowledged, and they align with changes we were already considering implementing. Janet Wilson pulled out a tablet and began making notes. We can schedule follow-up meetings to discuss specific policy changes. We can also arrange for Mrs. Martinez to participate in the development of new harassment reporting procedures. Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if she were watching this meeting happen to someone else. Less than 48 hours ago, she had been a quiet nurse worried about paying her mortgage. Now she was apparently helping to reshape hospital policy and becoming the face of workplace rights for healthcare workers. There's one more thing, Robert said, consulting his notes. Given the media attention this case has received, Mrs. Martinez has been invited to speak at the National Nurses Association conference next month about workplace advocacy and standing up to abuse. The hospital's support for her participation in that conference would be appreciated. Margaret Sterling looked as if she had been asked to endorse a competitor's product, but after a moment's consideration, she nodded. We can certainly support professional development opportunities for our staff. The meeting concluded with agreements to reconvene later in the week to finalize the details of Sarah's reinstatement and the new policies being implemented. As the administrators filed out of the conference room, Sarah remained seated, trying to process what had just happened. How do you feel? Robert asked, packing his documents back into his briefcase. Overwhelmed, grateful, still a little bit in shock. You should be proud of yourself, Sarah, not just for standing up to Mitchell, but for seeing this through. A lot of people would have accepted whatever the hospital offered just to get their job back. I kept thinking about all the other nurses who don't have union representation, who don't have supportive families, who can't afford to fight back when they're treated unfairly. That's exactly why this case matters. You're not just getting your job back. You're changing how hospitals think about staff protection and accountability. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica Chen. I heard Dr. Mitchell resigned. Thank you for showing me that someone would stand up for me. I'll never forget what you did. Another message followed from Patricia Johnson. The whole night shift is talking about your meeting. We're all proud of you, and we can't wait to have you back." Then another from Marcus Williams. "Just heard the news. Well done. BA won't be the same without Mitchell's toxic presence." Sarah read the messages as the elevator descended to the main floor, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat outside. She had risked everything to protect a colleague, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked out better than she could have imagined. As they walked through the hospital lobby, she noticed several staff members nodding and smiling at her with expressions of respect and admiration. Word of her vindication was apparently spreading quickly through the hospital's informal communication network. "One more thing," Robert said as they reached the main entrance. "Channel 12 still wants to do that interview. Now that you're cleared of all charges and getting your job back, it might be worth considering. Your story could inspire other healthcare workers who are dealing with similar situations." Sarah thought about it for a moment. A week ago, the idea of appearing on television would have terrified her. Now, after everything she had been through, it seemed like a natural extension of standing up for what was right. "Set it up," she said. "If my story can help other people find the courage to speak up, then it's worth telling." As she walked out of St. Mary's General Hospital and into the bright Arizona afternoon, Sarah Martinez realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past 48 hours. She was no longer just a nurse doing her job. She had become an advocate, a symbol, and hopefully an inspiration for others who found themselves facing impossible choices between their careers and their consciences. The parking lot where this had all begun looked exactly the same, but Sarah knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. And for the first time since Tuesday night, that felt like a very good thing. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the Phoenix Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 3,000 nurses, physicians, and healthcare administrators who had traveled from across the country to attend the National Healthcare Worker Safety Summit. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being paid to speak about workplace advocacy at conferences when 6 months ago she had nearly lost her career for doing exactly that. The spotlight felt warm against her face as she adjusted the microphone and took a breath. Behind her, a large screen displayed the summit's theme, breaking the silence, from survival to advocacy. Her own journey from a quiet emergency room nurse to a nationally recognized voice for healthcare worker rights still felt surreal, even after months of speaking engagements, media interviews, and policy consultations. "When I walked into St. Mary's General Hospital on that Tuesday night in August, I thought I was just starting another routine shift," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "I had no idea that the next 12 hours would change not only my life, but spark a national conversation about the culture of abuse that too many healthcare workers have endured in silence." In the front row, she spotted familiar faces. Jessica Chen sat beside Patricia Johnson, both wearing matching pins that read, "Nurses Stand Together." David and Emma occupied seats in the third row, David beaming with pride and Emma recording portions of the speech on her phone for her social media. Followers who had turned her mother into something of a teenage celebrity at school. "The question I'm asked most often is whether I would do it again. Knowing what I know now about the consequences and the spotlight that would follow, the answer is simple: absolutely. Because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing." The audience erupted in applause, and Sarah waited for it to subside before continuing. She had learned to use these moments of connection to build momentum for the more challenging parts of her message. "But here's what I want you to understand. My story isn't remarkable because I defended a colleague. It's remarkable because that defense was necessary in the first place. It's remarkable because complaints about abusive behavior had been filed for years and ignored. It's remarkable because we live in a world where a young nurse thought she had to accept being slapped by a doctor as part of the job." The applause was more subdued now, thoughtful rather than enthusiastic. Sarah had learned that the most important moments in her speeches came when she challenged her audiences to examine their own complicity in systems that enabled abuse. Since August, I've received thousands of emails and messages from healthcare workers sharing their own stories, nurses who've been screamed at in front of patients, residents who've been threatened and humiliated during training, support staff who've been treated as invisible by physicians who consider them beneath notice. The common thread in all these stories isn't the specific incidents of abuse. It's the silence that followed them. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed statistics that always made audiences uncomfortable. 78% of nurses reported experiencing workplace bullying. 42% had considered leaving the profession due to hostile work environments, and only 16% of healthcare workers who witnessed abuse reported it through official channels. We stay silent because we're told it's professional. We stay silent because we need our jobs. We stay silent because we're taught that rocking the boat is worse than letting people drown in toxic environments. But silence in the face of abuse isn't professionalism. It's complicity. Sarah's phone, which she kept on silent during speeches, was undoubtedly filling with text messages. Her story had resonated far beyond the healthcare community, attracting attention from workplace advocacy groups, women's rights organizations, and anyone who had ever faced the choice between standing up and staying safe. The speaking fees from events like this had transformed her family's financial situation. What had begun as a moment of protective instinct had evolved into a lucrative second career that supplemented her nursing salary and provided security she had never imagined. Emma's college fund was fully restored, their mortgage would be paid off 2 years early, and David had been able to reduce his teaching load to focus on writing the novel he had always dreamed of completing. The most profound change in my life hasn't been the media attention or the speaking opportunities, Sarah continued. It's been the relationships I've built with healthcare workers who refuse to accept abuse as normal. It's been working with hospitals to develop policies that protect staff and patients alike. It's been seeing young nurses like Jessica Chen find their voices and refuse to be silenced. She gestured toward Jessica, who stood and waved to the audience. The young nurse had become something of a symbol herself, representing the vulnerability of early career healthcare workers and the importance of experienced colleagues who were willing to protect them. Jessica and I work together now on the Workplace Safety Advisory Committee at St. Mary's. We review policies, investigate complaints, and ensure that no one has to choose between their safety and their career. The program has been so successful that it's being implemented at hospitals across Arizona and neighboring states. The irony of working for the same hospital that had nearly fired her wasn't lost on Sarah, but St. Mary's had undergone significant leadership changes following the Mitchell incident. Margaret Sterling had resigned under pressure from the board of directors, replaced by a CEO who made workplace culture a priority. The new policies Sarah helped develop had become a model for other healthcare systems facing similar challenges. Dr. Mitchell, the physician whose shoulder I broke that night, never returned to clinical practice. His medical license was suspended pending investigation of multiple assault allegations. He currently works for a pharmaceutical company in a position that doesn't involve patient contact. Sarah had learned about Mitchell's fate through Robert Hoffman, who continued to represent healthcare workers in similar cases. The doctor's fall from grace had been swift and complete, a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked abuse in professional settings. But this story isn't really about Dr. Mitchell or even about me. It's about the culture that created him and enabled him. It's about the systems that prioritize revenue over staff safety, that treat complaints as annoyances rather than warnings, that allow talented professionals to terrorize their colleagues without consequences. She clicked to her final slide, which displayed a quote from Maya Angelou: "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." The healthcare workers who have shared their stories with me over the past 6 months are no longer bearing them alone. They're speaking up, filing complaints, demanding change, and supporting each other in ways that would have been unimaginable before social media gave us the power to connect across institutional boundaries. The response to her advocacy work had extended far beyond individual hospitals. Sarah now served on the American Nurses Association's Committee on Workplace Safety, consulted with medical schools on professional behavior training, and had been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining workplace harassment in healthcare settings. When I return to my shift at St. Mary's tomorrow night, I'll be doing the same job I was doing 6 months ago. Starting IVs, administering medications, comforting patients and families, working alongside colleagues to save lives. But I'll be doing it in an environment where abuse is no longer tolerated, where speaking up is supported rather than punished, where young nurses like Jessica know they have advocates who will stand up for them. The standing ovation began in the front rows and spread throughout the auditorium like wildfire. Sarah had learned to accept applause gracefully, but it still felt strange to be celebrated for what had felt like an instinctive reaction to witnessing injustice. As the applause continued, she thought about the butterfly effect her actions had created. Jessica Chen was now pursuing a nurse practitioner degree with a full scholarship funded by the Sarah Martinez Foundation for Healthcare Worker Advocacy. Patricia Johnson had been promoted to Director of Nursing Education, tasked with developing programs that taught conflict resolution and bystander intervention. Marcus Williams had been appointed to the hospital's board of directors, the first emergency physician to hold such a position. The night that changed everything for me began with a young nurse asking a question about patient safety. Sarah concluded as the applause subsided. It ended with all of us asking bigger questions about the kind of workplace culture we're willing to accept. The answers to those questions will determine whether healthcare remains a profession that eats its young or becomes one that protects and nurtures them. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces that represented every level of healthcare, from student nurses to chief medical officers. 24 hours after I thought my career was over, my life was blessed in ways I never could have imagined. Not because I became famous or financially comfortable, but because I learned that standing up for what's right creates ripples that extend far beyond anything you can see in the moment. Every person in this auditorium has the power to create those ripples. The only question is whether you'll choose to use it. The final ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As Sarah left the stage, she was immediately surrounded by conference attendees wanting to share their own stories, ask for advice, or simply express gratitude for giving voice to experiences they had carried in silence. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Sarah sat at a table with other keynote speakers, including Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been instrumental in exposing Mitchell's pattern of abuse through her social media posts. The conversation ranged from policy recommendations to personal stories of transformation and advocacy. "You know what strikes me most about your story?" Dr. Foster asked as they shared dessert. "It's how quickly everything changed once people started speaking up. For years, Mitchell seemed untouchable. Then suddenly, within 48 hours, his entire career collapsed because people finally felt safe enough to tell the truth." Sarah nodded, thinking about the dozens of similar cases she had learned about through her advocacy work. The silence was never about protecting him. It was about protecting ourselves. Once we realized we could support each other, the silence became impossible to maintain. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside the convention center to call David and Emma. The Phoenix skyline glittered in the distance, a reminder that she was only a few miles from the hospital where her transformation had begun. "How did it go?" David asked, his voice warm with pride. "Better than I could have hoped. I think we're really starting to change things." "Mom," Emma's voice came through the phone. "My friend's mom is a nurse in California, and she says they're implementing policies like yours at her hospital. You're literally changing healthcare. Sarah smiled, remembering when her biggest concern had been whether Emma would be able to afford college. Now her daughter was witnessing firsthand how individual courage could create systemic change. I'm proud of you, David said simply. Not just for what you accomplished, but for who you've become through this process. As Sarah hung up and walked back toward the hotel, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a nurse whose biggest claim to fame was perfect attendance and excellent patient reviews. Tonight, she was returning home to an inbox full of speaking requests, consulting opportunities, and messages from healthcare workers who had found the courage to speak up because of her example. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, and adjusting to her new role as a public figure had required learning skills she never expected to need. But the most profound change had been internal, the knowledge that she could trust her instincts, stand up for her values, and create positive change even in systems that seemed immutable. Tomorrow she would return to St. Mary's for her regular shift, caring for patients and working alongside colleagues in an environment that had been fundamentally transformed by the events that began in a supply closet on a Tuesday night in August. The work would be the same, but everything else would be different. As she entered the hotel lobby, Sarah's phone buzzed with one final message of the day. It was from a nurse in Seattle. I filed a complaint against an abusive physician today. 6 months ago, I would have stayed silent. Thank you for showing me that someone would stand up for me if I had the courage to stand up for myself. Sarah smiled and put her phone away. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to speak up, stand up, and remind the healthcare community that staying silent in the face of abuse was never an option when patients and colleagues needed advocates. The night that had nearly ended her career had instead launched a movement. And as she rode the elevator to her room, Sarah Martinez knew that the best part of her story was still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.